The President of the United States just threatened to deploy ICE agents to every major airport in America starting Monday morning. Not for terrorism, not for a security threat, but as political leverage in a budget fight. If that sounds like something out of a different country's playbook, you're not imagining things. This is happening right now, and the implications go far beyond immigration policy or partisan politics. What you're about to hear is the full story behind this threat, why it represents a fundamental shift in how federal law enforcement gets used in America, and what it means if this actually happens. Because if ICE agents show up at TSA checkpoints across the country in the next 72 hours, we're not just talking about airport delays or political theater. We're talking about a stress test of American institutions that most people never expected to see. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how we got here, what the legal framework actually allows, and why this moment matters regardless of how you feel about immigration, Trump, or Democrats in Congress. This isn't about taking sides. This is about understanding what happens when executive power meets a government funding crisis at one of the most sensitive points in American infrastructure. Let's start with what actually happened, because the details here matter more than the headlines suggest. The threat came during a White House briefing on Thursday afternoon. President Trump was asked about the ongoing negotiations over Department of Homeland Security funding. Democrats in Congress have been holding up the DHS appropriations bill over disagreements about border wall funding, detention facility standards, and ICE enforcement priorities. The stalemate has lasted 3 weeks. DHS has been operating under a continuing resolution that expires this Sunday at midnight. Trump's response was direct. He said if Democrats don't approve his administration's funding terms by Sunday night, he will order immigration and customs enforcement agents to be stationed at airports across the country starting Monday morning. Not Customs and Border Protection agents who already work at airports. ICE agents, the domestic enforcement arm of immigration law. The stated purpose, according to the president, would be to conduct immigration enforcement operations at security checkpoints in baggage claim areas and throughout airport terminals. The explicit goal would be what he called maximum deterrence and maximum arrests of individuals in the country illegally. Now, before we go any further, let's be extremely clear about what this would actually mean in practice, because this isn't theoretical. ICE already has legal authority to operate in airports. They've done targeted operations before, but those have typically been small-scale, focused on specific individuals with deportation orders or criminal warrants. What Trump is describing is something categorically different. He's talking about large-scale presence operations where ICE agents would essentially be doing what CBP does at international arrivals, but applied to everyone moving through an airport, citizens and non-citizens alike. The immediate practical effect would be chaos. We're not talking about a few extra agents in the background. We're talking about a visible federal law enforcement presence conducting checks throughout airports that handle over 2 million passengers every single day in the United States. TSA is already the choke point in airport operations. Adding another layer of federal agents conducting enforcement actions would create delays measured in hours, not minutes. But the operational disruption isn't even the biggest part of this story. The bigger question is what legal authority Trump is claiming. and whether this use of ICE falls within the bounds of how immigration enforcement is supposed to work under American law. Here's what the law actually says. ICE operates under Title 8 of the U.S. Code, which gives immigration officers authority to interrogate any person believed to be an alien about their right to be in the United States. That authority exists anywhere in the country, not just at borders. Immigration officers can also arrest without a warrant any person they have reason to believe is in the country illegally and likely to escape before a warrant can be obtained. Those powers are broad, they're also not unlimited. ICE is bound by Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. They can't just stop anyone and demand papers without some reasonable suspicion. They can't conduct dragnet operations where they detain people purely based on appearance or ethnicity. At least, that's what the case law says. The question is what happens when the president orders ICE to set up at airports and start conducting checks. Are passengers being questioned because ICE has individualized reasonable suspicion? Or are they being questioned simply because they're trying to catch a flight? That distinction matters enormously under constitutional law. The Trump administration's argument would likely be that airports are functional borders, similar to how border checkpoints operate on highways near the Mexican border. At those checkpoints, Border Patrol can stop every vehicle and ask about citizenship status without individualized suspicion. The legal theory is that the border enforcement exception to the Fourth Amendment allows suspicionless stops in areas where border crossing is likely or recent. But airports aren't borders. When you fly from New York to Los Angeles, you're not crossing an international boundary. You're engaging in domestic travel, which is a constitutional right. The Supreme Court has held that freedom of movement within the United States is fundamental. Requiring citizens to prove their citizenship status just to travel between American cities starts to look a lot like an internal passport system, which is something the United States has never had and which has historically been associated with authoritarian governments. Now, the administration would counter that they're not stopping citizens. They're looking for people who are in the country illegally. But here's the problem. How do you identify someone as potentially being in the country illegally without stopping them first? You can't, which means in practice, ICE agents would have to be stopping people based on some criteria. And whatever that criteria is, it's going to raise serious Fourth Amendment and equal protection questions. This is where we need to pause and understand what's actually at stake here, because this isn't just an immigration debate. This is about the scope of federal law enforcement power in everyday American life. Immigration enforcement has historically been concentrated at borders and at workplaces. When ICE conducts interior enforcement operations, they typically target specific locations like factories or farms where there's evidence of illegal employment. Or they go after individuals who have final deportation orders and haven't left. These operations are controversial, but they're based on some predicate beyond just being in a public place. What Trump is proposing is different. He's talking about positioning federal agents at transportation hubs and having them question people who are simply trying to travel. That's not targeted enforcement. That's surveillance infrastructure. And once that infrastructure exists, it doesn't just go away when the political crisis ends. Think about how TSA became permanent after 9/11. Before 2001, airport security was handled by private contractors and was relatively minimal. After the attacks, TSA was created as an emergency measure. 24 years later, TSA is a permanent fixture of American life. Every single person who flies anywhere in the United States goes through TSA screening. It's normalized. Now imagine ICE becoming a permanent presence at airports in the same way. Imagine getting used to being questioned about your citizenship status every time you fly. Imagine that becoming normal for your kids. That's not a hypothetical slippery slope argument. That's how institutional changes happen. They start as emergency measures and then they never end. And here's the part almost nobody is talking about. Once ICE is deployed at airports for immigration enforcement, there's no logical reason to limit it to airports. Train stations move millions of people. Bus terminals move millions of people. Why wouldn't the same logic apply there? If the argument is that ICE needs to be everywhere to catch people who might be in the country illegally, then the limiting principle disappears. You end up with a federal law enforcement presence in every form of public transportation, conducting checks on everyone. That might sound like an exaggeration, but it's actually how this kind of enforcement expands. You can look at countries that do have internal immigration checkpoints. They didn't start that way. They started with limited operations that gradually expanded until checking your papers became a routine part of daily life. The United States has never gone down that road, and there are very good reasons why. But the immediate question isn't about the long-term implications. The immediate question is what happens on Monday if Trump actually follows through. And that depends on whether DHS leadership is willing to execute this order, whether ICE agents in the field will participate, and whether airports will cooperate. Let's take those one at a time because each one presents its own complications. DHS leadership is currently in an unusual position. The Secretary of Homeland Security is Kristi Noem, who was confirmed just 6 weeks ago. She came into the job with limited federal law enforcement experience and has spent most of her time so far focused on border operations. ICE itself is led by an acting director because the Senate hasn't confirmed a permanent one yet. That acting director reports to Noem, who reports directly to Trump. In a normal administration, you'd expect DHS lawyers to push back on an order like this by flagging the legal risks. Deploying ICE to airports without specific threat intelligence or targeted enforcement goals opens the department up to immediate lawsuits. You'd have constitutional challenges from civil rights groups. You'd have operational complaints from airlines and airport authorities. You'd have state attorneys general filing emergency injunctions. Any competent general counsel would lay all of that out before executing the order. But we're not in a normal administration. Trump has made it clear throughout his presidency that he expects cabinet officials to execute his directives, not to slow-walk them with legal objections. And he's fired officials who have resisted. So the calculation for Noem is whether she's willing to risk her job by telling the president this is a bad idea, or whether she goes along and lets the courts sort it out later. If the order comes down, it goes to ICE field offices. And this is where things get really interesting because ICE agents are federal law enforcement officers with significant discretion. They're not soldiers. They don't have to follow unlawful orders. And while immigration enforcement is part of their job, being used as political pawns in a budget fight isn't. There's already tension within ICE about how the agency is being used. The union that represents ICE officers has been publicly critical of policies they see as putting agents in impossible situations. Sending agents to airports to conduct mass operations without clear enforcement objectives is exactly the kind of mission that creates legal liability for individual officers. If an agent stops someone without proper reasonable suspicion and that person sues, the agent can be personally liable. That's not hypothetical, it's happened. So you could see a situation where some field offices comply and others don't. You could see agents showing up but not actively engaging in enforcement actions. You could see a patchwork response where the whole operation falls apart because there's no actual coordination or legal framework supporting it. And then there's the airports themselves. Airports are mostly owned by local governments or airport authorities, not the federal government. While federal agencies have jurisdiction to operate in airports, they don't control them. If an airport authority decides that having ICE conducting operations in their terminals is creating safety problems or interfering with passenger flow, they can ask ICE to leave. They can call local police to manage the situation. They can shut down terminals if things get out of control. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which operates JFK, Newark, and LaGuardia, has already said publicly that they won't facilitate immigration enforcement operations that disrupt airport operations. Los Angeles International Airport issued a similar statement. These are the busiest airports in the country. If they don't cooperate, ICE can't just force their way in. So the practical reality is that even if Trump orders this, and even if DHS tries to execute it, you're likely looking at a chaotic, uneven implementation that creates more problems than it solves. Which raises the question of whether this was ever meant to actually happen, or whether it's a bluff designed to pressure Democrats into caving on the funding bill. And that brings us to the political calculation behind this whole thing, because that's ultimately what this is. This isn't about immigration policy, it's about leverage. Trump needs Democrats to approve DHS funding on his terms. He wants more money for border wall construction. He wants fewer restrictions on ICE detention practices. He wants language in the bill that gives him broader authority over immigration enforcement. Democrats have said no. They're willing to fund DHS at current levels, but they're not willing to give Trump everything he's asking for. In a normal budget standoff, both sides negotiate until they find a compromise. Maybe Democrats agree to some wall funding in exchange for protections for dreamers. Maybe Trump backs off on detention standards in exchange for Democrats supporting more immigration judges. That's how legislating usually works, but Trump doesn't negotiate like that. His approach is to create a crisis and then blame the other side for not resolving it. He did the same thing with the 2019 government shutdown over border wall funding. He threatened to veto any bill that didn't include wall money, and then when the government shut down, he said it was Democrats' fault for not giving him what he wanted. The airport threat follows the same playbook. If Democrats don't fund DHS on his terms, he'll deploy ICE to airports and create massive disruptions. When travelers are stuck in security lines for hours and flights are delayed and arrests are happening in front of families with kids, Trump will say it's because Democrats wouldn't negotiate. Democrats will say it's because Trump is using federal law enforcement as a political weapon. The public will be confused and angry. And Trump is betting that in that scenario, the pressure falls more on Democrats than on him. The problem with that calculation is that it assumes the disruptions will be blamed on the right people. But Americans really don't like having their travel plans messed with. If people are missing flights because ICE is conducting operations at TSA checkpoints, they're not going to care whose fault it is politically. They're going to be mad at whoever is making it happen. And the person making it happen is the president. This is the same miscalculation Trump made during the 2019 shutdown. He thought the public would blame Democrats for not funding the wall. Instead, polls showed most Americans blamed Trump for forcing the shutdown in the first place. He eventually backed down and signed a funding bill without getting what he wanted. So, if this airport operation actually happens, and if it creates the kind of chaos everyone expects, there's a real chance it backfires politically. Trump might get a short-term boost from his base, who will see it as tough enforcement and standing up to Democrats. But he'll lose independents and moderate Republicans who just want the government to function normally. And that's assuming the operation doesn't turn into a legal disaster. Because the second ICE agents start detaining people at airports, the lawsuits begin. Civil rights organizations are already prepared for this. The ACLU, the National Immigration Law Center, and other groups have been wargaming what happens if Trump orders mass enforcement operations. They've got legal teams ready to file emergency motions in federal court. They've got lawyers prepared to deploy to airports to provide representation. They've been training volunteers on how to document potential Fourth Amendment violations. The legal theory for challenging this would be straightforward. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Stopping someone and demanding identification without reasonable suspicion is a seizure under Fourth Amendment case law. If ICE is stopping people at airports just because they're traveling without any individualized suspicion that they're in the country illegally, that's unconstitutional. The government would argue that immigration enforcement is different. That ICE has broad authority under immigration law, that airports are unique locations where extra scrutiny is justified, but those arguments have limits. The Supreme Court has never held that immigration enforcement gets a complete pass from Fourth Amendment scrutiny. Even at the border, where the government has maximum authority, there are constitutional limits on how intrusive searches and seizures can be. If this goes to court, the most likely outcome is that a federal judge issues a temporary restraining order blocking the airport operations until there's a full hearing. That would probably happen within the first 48 hours. The question is whether Trump complies with that order or whether he pulls a page from Andrew Jackson's playbook and says the courts can't enforce their ruling. That might sound dramatic, but it's not out of the question. Trump has repeatedly criticized federal judges who rule against him. He's called them partisan, illegitimate, and worse. If a judge blocks his ICE deployment and he decides to ignore that order, we're in constitutional crisis territory. Because at that point, you have the executive branch openly defying the judicial branch, and the only remedy is either congressional intervention or compliance by executive branch officials who refuse to carry out unlawful orders. This is why the stakes here go beyond immigration policy or even airport disruptions. What we're really talking about is whether the checks and balances in the American system still function when a president decides to test them. Now, there's another angle to this that hasn't gotten enough attention, and that's the international implications. Because deploying ICE to airports doesn't just affect Americans. It affects foreign nationals who are in the United States legally. Think about business travelers, think about tourists, think about students, think about people on work visas. All of those people have legal status to be in the United States. They have visas. They went through the proper channels, but if ICE is conducting operations at airports, those people become potential targets too. And here's the thing. When other countries see the United States deploying immigration agents to domestic airports and creating scenes where travelers are being questioned and detained, they respond in kind. If Chinese nationals or European tourists start getting caught up in ICE airport operations, you can bet that China and European countries will start doing similar things to American travelers abroad. This is how diplomatic tit-for-tat works. The business community understands this. The U.S. Travel Association, which represents airlines, hotels, and tourism companies, has already issued a statement opposing any airport enforcement operations that would disrupt travel. They're not making a political argument, they're making an economic one. The United States relies on international travel for business, tourism, and education. If the perception spreads that traveling to America means getting hassled by immigration agents, people will choose other destinations. The numbers here are significant. International travelers spent over $200 billion in the United States last year. That supports millions of jobs. If even a small percentage of those travelers decide to go elsewhere because they're worried about ICE operations at American airports, the economic hit is real. And it's not just about tourists. It's about business. Companies rely on being able to move employees internationally. If executives and specialists from other countries start avoiding travel to the United States because they don't want to deal with immigration enforcement at airports, that affects American companies too. They can't compete globally if their international partners and clients won't come here. So even from a pure self-interest standpoint, deploying ICE to airports is a bad idea. It creates economic costs that far outweigh whatever political points Trump thinks he's scoring. But that assumes he's thinking about this strategically, which is a big assumption. The more likely explanation is that this is an impulsive threat that Trump made without fully thinking through the consequences. He was frustrated about the funding fight. He wanted to sound tough. He said something dramatic. And now his staff is trying to figure out if he actually meant it or if it's just negotiating bluster. That's been the pattern throughout his presidency. Trump says something extreme, people freak out. His staff scrambles to either walk it back or figure out how to implement it. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. The problem is that you can't run a government that way, especially when you're talking about deploying federal law enforcement. Because here's what people need to understand about ICE. These are armed federal agents with arrest powers. When you send them into airports and tell them to conduct enforcement operations, they're going to do their jobs. And their job is to arrest people they believe are in the country illegally. That means people are going to get detained, families are going to get separated, people with pending asylum cases are going to get caught up. Legal residents who forgot their green cards are going to have problems. All of that creates human drama that ends up on social media. Videos of ICE agents arresting people in airports, kids crying, people being led away in handcuffs. And every single one of those incidents becomes a political liability for Trump, because even people who support strict immigration enforcement don't like seeing enforcement actions that look like civil rights violations. This is the fundamental problem with using law enforcement as political leverage. Once you deploy agents, they're going to enforce the law. And law enforcement in real life is messy, complicated, and often ugly. It's one thing to talk tough about immigration in a campaign rally. It's another thing to have ICE agents conducting arrests in an airport terminal while CNN is broadcasting it live. The Trump administration found this out during the family separation crisis in 2018. The policy of separating children from parents at the border was legally defensible under the administration's interpretation of immigration law. But when the images started circulating of kids in cages, the public outrage was so intense that Trump had to reverse course. He signed an executive order ending family separations even though his entire team had been defending the policy just days earlier. The airport threat carries the same risk. If this actually happens and if the images are bad enough, Trump will face pressure to back down, but by that point the damage is done. People have been arrested, flights have been disrupted. The story is out there, you can't unring that bell. So the smart play here from Trump's perspective would be to use the threat for leverage but not actually follow through. Let Democrats think he's serious. Let them worry about the political fallout. See if they blink and give him some of what he wants in the funding bill. Then declare victory and say the crisis has been averted. That's the art of the deal approach. Make a dramatic threat. Extract concessions. Move on, but it only works if the other side actually believes you'll follow through. And Democrats have learned over the past few years that Trump's threats are sometimes real and sometimes bluster, and it's hard to tell which is which until it actually happens. Right now, Democratic leadership is treating this as a real threat. Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries have both issued statements saying that deploying ICE to airports would be an abuse of power and that they won't negotiate under threats. Nancy Pelosi called it government by hostage-taking. Progressive Democrats are even more aggressive, calling for immediate articles of impeachment if Trump actually does this. But the moderate Democrats who actually control the votes in Congress are in a tougher spot. Some of them represent swing districts where voters want border security but also don't want chaos at airports. Those members are looking at this and thinking about their own re-election campaigns. If they're seen as the reason flights were delayed and people got arrested, that's not good. But if they cave to Trump's demands, their progressive base will revolt. This is exactly the kind of political calculation Trump is trying to force. He wants Democrats divided. He wants some of them to break ranks and push for compromise. He wants the squad fighting with the moderates while he sits back and watches. Whether it works depends on how unified Democrats stay and how much public pressure there is to end the standoff. If the airports do get disrupted and the public backlash is as bad as expected, Democrats can hold firm and wait for Trump to fold. But if the disruptions are manageable, or if Trump finds a way to blame Democrats effectively, then some moderates might decide compromise is better than prolonged crisis. There's also the possibility that this whole thing gets resolved before Monday because nobody actually wants this to happen. Sometimes in politics, the threat of disaster is enough to force a deal. Maybe Democrats agree to some additional border security funding in exchange for Trump backing off the airport threat. Maybe Trump declares that Democrats have negotiated in good faith and he's giving them more time. Maybe DHS announces that they've found alternative enforcement strategies that don't require airport operations. Any of those outcomes would let both sides save face and avoid the nightmare scenario. But it requires both sides to actually negotiate in good faith, which has been in short supply lately. The other wild card here is what happens in the courts before Monday. Civil rights groups are already preparing to file preemptive lawsuits. They're arguing that the mere threat of airport ICE deployments is causing harm because people are changing travel plans out of fear. If a judge agrees with that argument, you could have an injunction against the airport operations before they even start. That would give Trump an off-ramp. He could say that activist judges are preventing him from enforcing immigration law, blame the courts instead of Democrats, and move on to the next fight. His base would be satisfied because he tried. Democrats would be satisfied because it didn't happen. And the legal question gets kicked down the road. But that only works if Trump accepts the authority of the courts, which is not guaranteed. He's made clear that he views judicial review as an obstacle to his agenda rather than a legitimate check on executive power. If a judge blocks the airport deployments and Trump orders ICE to proceed anyway, we're back to constitutional crisis. That scenario is unlikely but not impossible. And the reason it's not impossible is that we've seen Trump test the limits of judicial authority before. When courts blocked his travel ban in 2017, he called the judges names but ultimately complied after the administration rewrote the order. When courts blocked his attempt to add a citizenship question to the census, he eventually gave up. But those were policy losses, not direct confrontations over presidential authority. This would be different. If Trump orders ICE to airports, a judge blocks it, and Trump says ICE is going anyway, that's the executive branch openly defying the judicial branch. At that point, individual ICE agents have to decide whether to follow Trump's order or the court's order. And if they follow Trump's order, they're personally liable for contempt of court and potentially civil rights violations. Most federal agents aren't going to take that risk. They have careers and pensions and families. They're not going to throw all of that away to be political soldiers for a president who might not even back them up if things go wrong. So even if Trump orders defiance, you'd probably see mass non-compliance from ICE itself. That would be its own kind of crisis, because then you have a president issuing orders that his own agencies won't execute. That's a collapse of executive authority, and it raises fundamental questions about whether Trump can actually govern if his own administration won't follow his directives. The whole situation is a mess. And the frustrating part is that it's an entirely self-created mess. There was no emergency that required this threat. There was no imminent danger that ICE needed to respond to. This is purely about political leverage in a budget fight. And the fact that we're even having this conversation shows how far the boundaries of normal governance have shifted. 10 years ago, the idea that a president would threaten to deploy federal law enforcement to airports as a negotiating tactic would have been unthinkable. It would have been seen as an abuse of power that transcended partisanship. Republicans and Democrats would have condemned it together. The president would have been forced to back down immediately. Today, it's just another Thursday in American politics. Half the country thinks this is Trump standing up for border security. The other half thinks it's authoritarian overreach. And everyone is waiting to see if it actually happens or if it's just more noise in an already deafening political environment. That normalization of extreme tactics is maybe the most dangerous thing about all of this. Because once you establish that it's okay for a president to weaponize federal law enforcement for political purposes, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Future presidents will look at this and think they can do the same thing, and the ratchet only goes one direction. Imagine a future Democratic president threatening to deploy the FBI to gun shows unless Republicans approve gun control legislation. Or a future Republican president threatening to send the DEA to states with legal marijuana unless Democrats approve drug policy changes. Once you accept that law enforcement is a political tool rather than a neutral function of government, there's no logical stopping point. This is why institutional norms matter. They're not just polite traditions. They're the guardrails that prevent power from being abused, and when those norms break down, you don't get them back easily. You have to rebuild them through painful experience and political consequences, but that only happens if the public demands it. If voters shrug and say this is just politics as usual, then it becomes usual. And that's how democracies decay. So what should people actually do about this? Because complaining on social media doesn't change anything, and most people feel powerless in the face of this kind of political brinksmanship. The most important thing is to stay informed about what actually happens versus what gets threatened. There's a huge difference between Trump saying he's going to do something and Trump actually doing it. Don't let the threat itself become the story if the threat never materializes. Hold media accountable for distinguishing between the two. Second, if you have representatives in Congress, let them know what you think. Call their offices. Email them. Show up at town halls. Members of Congress pay attention to constituent pressure, especially in swing districts. If they hear overwhelmingly that voters don't want ICE deployed to airports for political reasons, that affects their calculation on the funding bill. Third, support organizations that are doing the work to protect civil liberties and hold government accountable. Groups like the ACLU, the National Immigration Law Center, and others are going to be the ones filing lawsuits and providing legal representation if this goes forward. They need resources to do that work. Fourth, vote. This is the most basic but also the most important point. The reason Trump thinks he can make these kinds of threats is because he calculates that it helps him politically. If voters consistently reject politicians who use law enforcement as political leverage, politicians will stop doing it. But if voters reward it, it continues. And finally, have conversations with people who disagree with you about this. Not arguments, conversations. Try to understand why someone might support tough immigration enforcement even if they're uncomfortable with this specific tactic. Try to find common ground on the idea that government should function according to law and principle rather than crisis and threat. That kind of dialogue is hard work. It's much easier to retreat into partisan corners and yell at each other. But the only way out of this cycle is for enough people to say they're tired of crisis governance and they want something better. Whether that happens is up to all of us. The political class will keep doing what works for them until voters make it stop working. Right now, it's working. Politicians get attention, they energize their bases, they raise money, and they mostly face no consequences. Until that changes, expect more of this, but it doesn't have to be this way. American democracy has survived worse crises than a budget fight over DHS funding. We've survived actual civil war, economic collapse, foreign invasion, and internal subversion. We've survived because enough people in each generation decided that preserving democratic institutions mattered more than winning every political fight. This moment is testing whether that's still true, whether Americans still believe that how you govern matters as much as what you govern, whether the rule of law means something beyond what's convenient for the party in power. Whether we're capable of solving problems through democratic processes instead of through threats and crisis. The answer to those questions won't come from Washington. It'll come from citizens deciding what kind of country they want to live in and demanding that their leaders deliver it. That's always been how American democracy has worked when it works. From the bottom up, not the top down, so watch what happens on Monday. Watch whether Trump follows through or backs down. Watch how Democrats respond. Watch how the public reacts. Watch how institutions hold up or fail to hold up. And then decide what you think it means and what you're willing to do about it. Because this story isn't really about ICE and airports and budget fights. It's about power and accountability and the health of American democracy. And that's a story we're all writing together whether we realize it or not. The next chapter starts Monday morning. We'll all find out then whether this was a bluff, a disaster, or something in between. And whatever happens will tell us something important about where we are as a country and where we're headed. Pay attention. This matters. If you found this analysis helpful, subscribe to this channel. We're trying to do independent political coverage that cuts through the noise and helps you understand what's actually happening versus what you're being told is happening. That kind of journalism only survives if people support it. So subscribe if you want more of this. Leave a comment below answering one question. Do you think Trump will actually deploy ICE to airports on Monday, or is this a negotiating tactic that won't happen? I'm genuinely curious what people think because this could go either way. Let me know in the comments, and share this video with someone who follows politics. We need more people having informed conversations about this stuff instead of just reacting to headlines. You can help make that happen by sharing analysis that goes deeper than the surface level. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.